Good afternoon and welcome to today's ADWEEK webinar, where we'll be looking at influencer marketing as a gateway to Latino subcultures. And really what that's about is ways for you to both make connections with this multicultural audience and also break some of those cultural myths that go on. And today's webinar is being sponsored by Adsmovil. I'm Stuart File, Vice President of Branded Content at ADWEEK, and I am going to be your host for today's webinar. Before we begin and before I bring our speakers up here, I just want to take a few moments and make sure that everyone knows what to expect from today's event, and also that you're all familiar with the features of our webinar platform. Our actual event should go somewhere, or our presentation should go somewhere in the 30 to 35 minute range. And of course, as you can tell, today's webinar is a video webinar. But after our actual presentation, we are going to have plenty of time for audience questions. So again, if you have a question for our speakers at any point during the webinar, you can submit your question using the question tool that you should see there on the left side of your screen. It should be underneath the video window where you're seeing me right now. It's not too late, by the way, to invite your colleagues to come join us today. And we'd really love it if they would. About 15 minutes ago, we sent everyone a final reminder email for today's webinar. In that email, you'll find a link over to the registration page. It's in the form of a bit.ly. Go ahead in there, grab that link, send it off to your colleagues. There's still plenty of time for them to come on in, register, and join us live. But if they can't make it live, they still should register because today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand. And we're going to send a link to that on-demand version to everyone who's registered for today's event. And that should go out later today, probably about 3:30, 4 o'clock Eastern time. So keep your eyes out for that. Today's webinar will have some presentation slides. Sometimes when we do video, we don't have a lot of presentation, but we've got some interesting things that are going to be shared today. So if at any point you want to get a PDF of today's slide deck, you'll be able to download it in the event resources area. And that tab should be near where the question tool is for you. So you can go on in there at any point and grab a PDF of today's slides. Lastly, I just want to remind everyone to please check out the ADWEEK webinar calendar, www.adweek.com/webinars with an S. We've got a whole lot of webinars coming up. We've been doing 3 a week, and come May, I think we're going to be doing 4 or 5, and maybe 1 week, 6 or 7 webinars. Wide range of different topics, all the things that are on your mind as a marketer today. So see what's coming up. Sign up for an upcoming webinar. If you go to adweek.com/webinars, you'll also get access to our full archive of on-demand webinars. That's every webinar that we've done over the past 12 months. So go on in there and check it out. All right, let me move on to today's webinar, and let me just take a moment here and introduce our speakers. First off, we're very happy to have Andrew Polsky. Andrew is the Chief Revenue Officer of Adsmovil, where he leads revenue, and that's really, again, over there. And if you're not familiar with Adsmovil, that is the first and largest mobile ad network and data solutions company targeting the U.S. Hispanic market. Andrew's just going to give us just a brief overview of Adsmovil before we get into some of the details of today's webinar. And that's, of course, going to come from our other 2 speakers. First off, also from Adsmovil, we have Zulema Baez. She's the VP of Strategic Accounts, and as well as also political. And of course, as you can imagine there, she works in revenue, driving with some of the major accounts, again, across mobile, audio, and really all of that area. And she's quite experienced in a lot of these areas, working previously at Univision and also Katz Media. And then our guest speaker today, Albert Thompson, who's the managing director of digital over at Walton Isaacson, certainly one of the top multicultural agencies out there. And again, he really understands how technology has continued to transform marketing while disrupting today's conventional consumer engagement models. And Albert will be, again, discussing a lot of these points. So let me welcome our speakers and let me, as everybody does here, fumble along and bring Andrew up on screen. Andrew, there you go. Take on today's webinar. Welcome.
Thanks. Thank you, Stuart. And I just want to thank everyone for joining today. As we know, the last year and a half to 2 years, there's been a lot of social and political change, and diversity and inclusion and multicultural marketing has been really thrust into the limelight, so to speak. So we're very happy that we're seeing ADWEEK and other publications really kind of bringing this topic up to par and up to in front of everyone, as well as the big six, the big trading firms as well, just trying to make diversity and inclusion and multicultural marketing a thing to really talk about. And so with our 10th anniversary at Adsmovil in the United States, we're very happy to kind of bring this webinar to you, and we're happy to be as well a minority-owned company. And what I'll do is just kind of show a little sizzle reel that'll be short and sweet, and then we'll kind of get into the presentation. So here we go.
One thing is reaching, and a whole other thing is connecting. Now, if you want to have a marked effect on Hispanics, we guarantee massive impact. 40 million of it, to be precise. We're not in the business of probability, but certainty. Sure, many will claim they can put your brand in front of Hispanics. We'll put your brand inside their minds and hearts. True, not only do we have the largest scale, but we've been at it longer than anybody else in the US, building a proprietary data hub across Latin America's top 7 markets. So we can go way beyond census data into frequency, time spent, and content consumption patterns, and can arm your brand with real-time insights on Hispanics' interests. In fact, we could almost pinpoint each Hispanic individual with near surgical precision across every possible touchpoint, from mobile and smart TVs to tablets and desktops. That goes to all things Hispanic, from blended to Hispanophiles to subcultures and their passion points. Now, add our direct relationship with over 1,200 Hispanic premium publishers and top-notch influencers. Elevate it to the power of Adsmovil Studio, delivering unmatched creative services and custom content production. Then divide it by the Hispanic market's most robust track record. And you get the one digital advertising company in the US completely fluent in Hispanic. Say hola to Adsmovil. Precisely Hispanic.
You can tell that ever since Adsmovil launched 10 years ago as a mobile ad network, we've really evolved into really attacking and offering all these different channels now, including branded content to all of our advertisers. So to get into it, I just wanted to thank, again, first and foremost, Stuart, as well as Albert Thompson, one of our best and favorite partners, for coming to this webinar and helping us kind of get the word out on Latin subcultures and connections. So I will hand it off to my stellar VP of political and strategic accounts, Zulema, and I hope you guys enjoy. Thanks.
Thanks for the intro, Andrew. So Zulema, you about ready to have some, good stimulating chat on a lot of the things that you and I have sort of roadmapped, I guess, over the past 2.5 years at this point. So I think it'll be a great dialogue. I'll let you kind of set up what we're going to get into, and then let's get it started.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much, Andrew, for the intro, and thanks, Albert, for taking your time out today to be a part of this conversation. So just to kind of give you guys an overview of the agenda that we're going to be discussing, we're going to first look at why recognizing the subcultures is so important when advertising to the Hispanic, audience, understanding the consumer profiles, why influencer marketing as a gateway, and then the regional level of influencer marketing, and then what's next on the roadmap.
All right, sounds good. So, I'll kind of take everyone through the story, but again, when I look at it, this is a lot of things you and I talked about when we really embarked on the partnership of things we wanted to solve. I think a lot of people discount to what degree the subcultures really matter. So when you look at this particular stat, 50% of Hispanic adults say that they often describe themselves in their family based upon their origin or heritage. meaning they do not look at them as a non-white U.S. Hispanic. So it really comes down to country designation. So to me, this is like the inflection point. This is really what this is about. And you and I had some relatively spirited conversations about this. So, take me through a lot of the stereotypes out there and the assumptions that people believe, and a lot of it from a marketing standpoint, that you can just sort of get away with the notion of we have a U.S. Hispanic focus in our marketing efforts, and understand that there's a lot more detail behind that if you really want to be successful in the long view.
Yeah, so I think one of the things, that I think advertisers need to understand is that they're not just one homogeneous group, right? There's all these different subcultures that make up this Hispanic population in the U.S. One of the things is when I look at myself, I don't really consider myself Hispanic. The first thing that I always say is Dominican. Like, I am Hispanic, but the first thing that comes to mind is I'm Dominican, right? And I think that's the thing that advertisers need to understand, right? So we're Dominican, we're Puerto Rican, we're Mexican. So you have to understand that there's this cultural pride when it comes to the Hispanic subcultures in the U.S. The other thing too that always comes to mind is, are you Hispanic? Are you Latino? Or now are you Latinx? So I think for the most part, I think the first thing that I always like to distinguish is Hispanic, Latino. I think it kind of goes hand in hand. The difference is obviously Hispanic includes Spain. Latino is more of a focus on Latin America and including Brazil. And then Latinx now is something that's really come to light, especially, in the recent political cycle that just passed. But only about 3% of the Latin or Hispanic community is actually embracing the Latinx terminology. But I just think it's just important to understand that we're not all the same. We are all Hispanic or Latino, however you want to describe yourself, but we have our own cultural nuances. So I'm Dominican, my best friend can be Mexican, and my other friend can be Puerto Rican, and we're just all Hispanic together. And it's understanding the differences between the subcultures.
Right. Now let's get into a little bit of that, because when you look at like Asian American population, people I think are more akin to the distinction because the language is so different. When you think about Korean versus Filipino versus Chinese versus Japanese, I think there's an expectation that because all of the subcultures under U.S. Hispanic speak Spanish, that it is essentially in the spoken language, because it's a little bit different when we're talking about writing, in particular for digital, for social media, but in the spoken language, that there actually are distinctions in dialect. Like you yourself, New York Dominican, could go to a Latin country and not understand what they're saying, and they would not understand what you're saying. So that doesn't go away because there's migration into the U.S. That is a very real factor. But I think it'd be helpful for the audience to understand that even from a language perspective, when it's spoken, that there are distinctions in dialect and in cultural relevance and slang that still create a communications disconnect.
Absolutely there is, and I think that's important to understand that in terms of, the subcultures. Like there's an example of, I think, a straw in Spanish. It's like every country has a different thing. Like you can say calimete, you can say sorbete, you can say all these different things. And that's just straw, but there's like 12 different countries that say it differently, right? And then that's okay. I think that's what makes the Hispanic community so unique. It's we all have this, connection with the language, right? The language binds us together with the Spanish language, but we all have our different cultural nuances. Like, there's like the Caribbean-based countries have more of an Afro-Caribbean-based influence versus like a country like Venezuela or Argentina. And I think those are things that advertisers need to understand when talking to these subcultures, and understanding that, again, we're not all one homogeneous group. We're all kind of a little bit different. And I think it's about, creating authentic content that will help with that credibility and trust with the community.
Agreed. I think the other thing that we always talk about is the assumptions on regionality, that, it's predominantly Cubans in Miami, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans in New York. It's Mexican in the Southwest and West Coast, but like I have counterparts that are Salvadorian who live in LA. Right. So I have friends who are Dominican who live in LA. So one of the things that, there's always a geographic migration that happens where all the communities just don't stay locked. I mean, there's a Dominican population outside of Boston that most people don't really understand. So one thing to be good is kind of speak to the audience about how a lot of that has shifted. And it's not just those groups sort of landlocked to those regions, that other subcultures are now presenting in areas that were once dominant one subculture of Latino, that now there's a series of cultures that exist.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that leads us to our next slide about just in general, the Hispanic population and the explosion of it, right? Obviously, there's no denying that the Hispanic population is growing. It's making up, the growth of the U.S. But one thing is, like you said a good point, like you're seeing like an influence of Dominicans now are in Massachusetts, right? So I was actually born in Massachusetts, little tidbit on the side. So I'm one of those people that, helped in terms of that, growth in the Massachusetts region. But we're also seeing like a state like Rhode Island, which you would never think, right? It's such a small state. But we're seeing they have double digits growth. They went from, almost an 8% in terms of their Hispanic population to now almost 16% makeup in terms of their Hispanic population. We're seeing states that you would never think of having a big Hispanic population, like a Connecticut, where they're almost now 16.5% Hispanics in Connecticut. So again, there is this, growth coming from different areas. And, you look at a state like Florida, right? When you think of Florida, when you think of Miami, you right away think Cuban, which, yes, there's a huge Cuban population. But we're also seeing a huge influx of Venezuelans in Miami and Colombians as well. So we're seeing that. And, in LA, we're seeing a big influx of Salvadorians as well. So I think it's just understanding that, different groups are coming to the U.S. and they're not just normally going to the specific regions that they're supposed to go to. They're venturing out and going into other DMAs.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you think about digital, in particular social media, with the degrees of separation essentially being cut down, now it's being merchandised. What are some of the other pockets that any subculture, doesn't matter, if you're coming from Africa, come from Asia, could actually migrate into less of the typical DMA. So we've seen Chicago rise and become a major mecca for Latino community. Obviously, when you look at the funnel of Mexico, all the states bordering above it, Texas, Arizona, Nevada, there's a major amount of essentially influx. But then, you start to look at unconventional cities like Raleigh, Charlotte, some of these cities that have been more definitively, let's call it Black. Like, Chicago's a city that's, when you look at multicultural, has been predominantly Black over the past half century. But when you start to look at it now, a lot of the influx of growth is essentially Latino. So I think it's important for other people, if you look at the meteoric rise of the population in this country, they're not all going into the typical major cities. When we started, in particular, some of our clients, Lexus being one of them, we looked at the top 3 DMAs, Miami, LA, New York. Then it went to a top 10. And now it's like a top 30. And that's just really just the beginning. It's just going to be a point where it's probably going to be a top 40, top 50, just because the surge is happening, even in flanker cities. So you think let's have Houston, Dallas, but now like you have to look at San Antonio. You have to think of Rio Grande. You have to think of Austin. So it's really sort of fascinating to look at how it's really shape-shifting, the sort of landscape of the U.S. population.
Yes, absolutely. And it's not slowing down, right? It's just going to continue to grow, which is something that's really exciting.
Right. So when you look at that, I think when you see about the influx of all the, 20 different countries represented in LATAM, identity is one of the things trending when you think about the Latin community. I mean, because this notion of there are a lot of different subcultures present, everyone needs to declare point of origin, who they are, essentially, why it matters. And the same thing that people need to understand, difference that, as we see more Africans migrate into the U.S., they don't adopt and normalize themselves to what African Americans do. So when you think about someone Venezuelan, Ecuadorian, Colombian, Panamanian, they're not just going to do, quote unquote, what Mexicans do. They're really going to bring heritage front and center. So talk to us a little bit about this notion of, heritage, beyond individuality, beyond community, but the notion of heritage really sort of playing out and how that's being brought to the fore.
Yeah, I think it's just one of the things that as a Hispanic Latino community, we're just very proud of that, right? We're very proud of our culture. You can see it, being from New York during the Puerto Rican Day Parade when all the flags are out, right? You love that. It's a beautiful feeling. It's a beautiful connection that you have, One of the things that I always like to point out is, it's really about being ambicultural. Like the fact is that you can transition between being Hispanic and also being American, right? You can kind of live between both languages. One of the things that I always like to say is I can laugh in English and in Spanish, right? So I'm in both. I can do both. And it's just that. It's the identity of the fact that you are proud of being who you are. You're proud of being Dominican, you're proud of being Puerto Rican. And the fact is that you have to understand that each of these cultures are not going to go away. They're just becoming prouder. Like one of the things with me is I try to make sure that my kids understand that, you're American, but you're Dominican. You're Dominican American. If you were to ask my boys what they are, what their nationality is, they say they're Dominican. And I think that's something that as Hispanics, we always kind of put that identity and that heritage in front of our kids. We are proud of that cultural heritage that we have and identifying it always.
Right. Now, it's an important point to note. So one of the things, just kind of take a quick look at for everyone, just to understand the value proposition of the Latino consumer in terms of profile. I mean, equating to a $2 trillion GDP. I mean, look, the numbers are there. It's almost staggering when you look at was a decade ago. One of the things we're going to get into is like why influencer marketing and sort of why now. And I think we'll get into some of the notes when you talk about the importance of cultural heritage and the level of pride, because marketing is essentially going through a shift. Everything was about, to a degree, customer experience, user experience. And now it's those are table stakes. I mean, that's the expectation that customers have a dynamic experience, whether it's at physical retail, whether it's through fulfillment, whether it's online shopping, whether it's just the brand experience, whether it's an event. Now you see a real push towards customer intimacy. And look, we all experience brand messaging, but we don't have an intimate relationship, and certainly not with some of the vehicles. But when we think about influencers, there tend to be people that are aspirational to us. We may connect with, we may exchange dialogue, we may comment against. So there's a greater level of intimacy. And when you think about the intake of one's culture, because you can't always do it if you're from a certain country through mainstream media. There may not be TV programming for you. There may not be talk show, radio, podcasting. There may not even be .coms like editorial sites. But an influencer represents who you are with the same pride. So talk to us about, because I know you follow a lot of the influencers that we work with jointly, that how it feeds the funnel of pride and intake of one's heritage when following someone who literally has similar ideals, talking about similar narratives, similar dynamics. But take us through a little bit of that, because I think that would help people to understand why that's so important if you're really going to connect with all the subcultures.
Yeah, I think what it is, it's relevant, right? It's authentic. You feel a connection to the person. And I think as an advertiser, I think that's what you want to build. You want to build that connection, that trust. And if you have an influencer that kind of speaks your language or can identify with you in something that, your parents used to do in the past, and they make it into a joke, and you can laugh and you can relate to that. And then you see them maybe do a partnership with an advertiser, and they're taking that into like one of the influencers that I know me and you have spoken about is LeJuan James. Like, I think he does a great job of kind of portraying, that Dominican, Puerto Rican, heritage, and the fact of his relationship with his mom. Like, I'm like, oh my God, that's my mom. So you have those reflections, and then you see his partnerships that he might have with advertiser, and that kind of translates to those advertisers and their messaging together. That blends it, and it feels authentic. It doesn't feel like an advertiser is just like, oh, let me just check off the box and be here for Hispanic Heritage Month. No, it's about being authentic and always being there for this group, and understanding the importance of heritage and identity is for them. Right.
No, I like that. I think when we think about the moment influencer marketing had last year, I mean, it kind of came to the ground, stopped and broke. But then there was almost an immediate rebound because they became a vehicle where other media channels maybe weren't operational, aren't as viable. Obviously, they were needed to tell the story where you just couldn't do normal sort of production. And if you look at if everyone looks at the note in the middle, I mean, there's a premium now for multicultural influencers. And I think the one thing is, and maybe you can provide some context to that, I think we're looking at the evolution from influence to treating them as creators. And maybe it would be helpful is with some of the influencers, not necessarily just the ones we've worked on with for Lexus, but talk about how a lot of these individuals are now becoming more creators, less of, hey, I'm a narrative, I have beauty shots, people follow me, but more or less creating the story for brands in a way that's, it's not as easy to approach that when you look at other media channels.
Yeah, I think that, when you think of an influencer, I think you have to look at them as that. They are creators, right? And you kind of have to give them kind of, free range to kind of do what they want to do and create that content that engages all of those users that they have. So there's a reason why they have, why they may be a micro or macro or why they have these followings. It's because they create content that connects to people. So it's about letting them kind of understand how you're going to connect with the advertiser. Obviously, we do get some type of direction from the advertiser as to what they want us to portray, but it's kind of giving them that free range. And I think that that's what really speaks well. I know that we did that with Lexus, and I think we had some great content that some of our influencers were able to produce, and we're doing it with some of our other clients as well. And we're really excited about what they're able to do for us and get that messaging across in a organic, authentic way.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the creator side, because when you start to look at how impractical it is, you go to a lot of major media companies. Look, this is all segments, all cultures, and really speak to all the subcultures. I mean, part of it is when you look at it, is there content and programming that aligns? Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. Some of the media companies are more dominant in terms of the type of content they produce and literally who they cast, almost down to where they even shoot production. So it always has an aesthetic or a feel that could be, let's say, more Mexican dominant. It could be more Caribbean, between Puerto Rican, Dominican, Cuban, what have you. So when you start to look at this, and in some of it from an advertiser standpoint, you can't create 10 different TV spots,
right?
10 different audio spots. I mean, they're just inherent budget constraints. They don't allow you to say, okay, we're going to splice this 20 ways. And because of, obviously, there's not the perception of a language barrier, then it's like, well, this is essentially a catch-all. We just need to cast it. But when you go to a creator, when you go to an influencer, you obviously have the opportunity for them to portray the brand through their eyes as a Venezuelan, as a Colombian, as an Ecuadorian. I mean, speak to us about the importance of that when, you know, you could represent a country of origin that just doesn't have programming in the US necessarily representative of your country of origin. And there are things that are done very different that are played out on the screen. So you can't, it's content to watch, but not easily to identify with. But I would imagine as a creator, that changes everything for a brand.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a great thing about, you know, using influencers. You can get down to pretty much any subculture. Like there's influence, like you mentioned, there's been such a big boom with the influencer, you know, marketing population that you can get down to any subculture. If you want to find someone that's, you know, of course, Dominican, Puerto Rican, Colombian, Cuban, you can get down to any specific demographic that you would like with an influencer, whether they're young, whether they're a mom, whether they're a health fitness mom that's Dominican, or, you know, it's crazy how granular you can get with the type of influencer that you want. So I think that's really important for an advertiser maybe that doesn't have the biggest budget, that they, you know, that they maybe want to target different demographics or different, you know, subcultures in the Hispanic community. They can, maybe they want to talk to, you know, a New York environment, but they want to maybe have two different types of influencers, one that's targeting maybe a Dominican or Puerto Rican, but maybe one that wants to maybe talk to the new, you know, the population growth of the Mexican population in New York as well. We can get an influencer in New York that's of Mexican descent that can talk to that audience. And I think that's a great tool for advertisers to have.
Right. Now, I mean, the one thing that's very interesting, because you have a bit of a network TV background, when you look at all the range of influencers you guys work with and can procure, I mean, there's some people that I would imagine their subscriber base, or following base, you know, basically mirrors that of a viewership base of a TV show. So let's talk influencer reach to ratings per se. I mean, because look, you know, it's not like we're talking about network programming necessarily on NBC, CBS, where, you know, it's 9 million and it's the #1 show. We're talking about smaller shows, smaller audience, could be 500,000 people viewership, you know, week to week. And then you see an influencer who has, you know, 500,000, 400,000, 1 million. So speak to a little bit of that in terms of what you've seen in terms of like the notion that some of these influencers, like literally in terms of who they get in front of, could actually rival that around programming.
Absolutely. Like there's some influencers, like, you know, if you look at the slide, yeah, you know, we can get down to like a nano or micro, but we have these mega. Yeah, some of them are celebrities, like, you know, we can have like a Juanes or anything like that, but we have, like, I always like to mention them again, like a La Juan Gem or an Aracelis Lopez, where, you know, Aracelis reaches almost, I can't say that's more like 5 million. So it's a lot of people, while La Juan James is like 2.4 million in terms of his following. That's incredible in terms of the following that he has, and then the engagement rate in terms of what he can offer to an advertiser.
Wow.
So I think that's something that, you know, you can reach these subcultures, and you can reach them like the same, like you mentioned, like almost like if you're doing like a TV viewership in terms of the eyes that you're trying to reach, right, and the engagement.
Right. No, it's good stuff. I mean, I think one of the things we looked at in particular for automotive are the real dynamics around finding a buyer or a consumer. And, you know, looking at the visual, you can see that, you know, the Latino consumer considers more vehicles as they get closer to purchase. You look at the graph, they're actually the bar in yellow. When you look at the other subcode, you know, black is right there. And then obviously, but, you know, you look at the difference between, let's say, Asian American, it's substantially left in terms of the consideration. So when we think about this, we know that the growth isn't just monolithically Hispanic, and isn't just to say that it's just Mexican. But we know that a lot of people, when you look at buyer behaviors, bring country of origin as their bias to the products that they will consider. Meaning someone who is maybe Venezuelan or Argentinian will consider a more European brand first. based upon the influence in their home country, based upon what product was there. We know that someone who's Mexican would consider Japanese just because of the amount of Japanese cars in the home country. So for us, it's very important to be conscious of how the subcultures break down, because you can't make the assumption that as a segment that is considering more from a purchase opportunity, that it's literally like you can just essentially double down and hone into, let's say, one major subgroup and say, okay, that's it. That's what we focus on. The difference in consideration could be that different subcultures just essentially look at different product. We may be rolling them up, but our notion was that, when you look at considering 6 vehicles for Gen Xers, 5 for millennials, like that is a massive number when you look at all the other numbers on the grid. And we have to be a lot more intentional about where those preferences are, why they exist, and making decisions based upon that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's something that is very important to look at. Absolutely. I'm just thinking about myself. I think we had this conversation when I was thinking about purchasing a vehicle, how many different cars I was looking at. And, and it is that, understanding that there is some influence maybe coming back from home, what vehicles were more used there, or even some family things as well, right?
Right. Absolutely. So look, one of the things that was great in working with you all in the partnership, we were already doing mobile display, we were doing digital audio, we were doing connected TV. We literally started to look at, well, how do we layer in influencer at the local level, the regional level, and supporting that? Essentially we do national programs that have influencers tied to them. A lot of them are with media partners. It's a custom content program or integrated program. But this was specifically like identifying influencers in market of different subcultures, not just the ones stereotypically that essentially exist in those DMAs. So you see, obviously, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Miami. We have a few other cities on the roadmap for this year. But one thing I think would be helpful is sort of take us through, a bit of the selection here. But I think also the passion for the brand from cultures that maybe weren't on the roadmap. I think Venezuelan is probably one subculture really sort of went in on in particular. But I think the average person wouldn't think, let's say, Venezuelan in some of these cities. So speak to that, because I think that's an important point for people to understand. It's not just because you're in Miami, you pick this segment. There may be a new segment that has a growing passion for the brand. And that's who you need to lean into to help drive influence and consideration.
Yeah, so absolutely. When you're looking at a market like Miami, right, where it's so diverse, there's so many different Hispanic, groups, subcultures in the market. We looked at Venezuela just because we knew that there's been such an uptick in the population in Miami, and we decided to do Venezuelan, and also they had a huge following as well, very well in terms of creating content and engaging with the brand and just really owning the brand. And then we also decided to focus on Dominican because we know that there was a bigger influence too of Dominicans in the population, and we had kind of that Afro-Caribbean feel to it as well. Then when we looked at markets like San Antonio, Houston, obviously those are very predominantly Mexican markets. So we found Mexican influencers, but we decided to do a little bit different. In Houston, we had a young couple that's kind of hip, beat, and then we had another in Houston. We had another lady that was into health and things like that. And then in Dallas, we found another young woman, I don't want to say her lady, young woman that's also Mexican descent, but was just fun and engaging. And it's all about lifestyle and health and things like that. So I think it's just about kind of just finding the influencer that kind of fits the brand, because we knew what we were trying to push in terms of the brands for Lexus with the IS launch, and we wanted someone that was hip, that was going to capture that feel for the Lexus brand by also connecting with the subcultures of the market.
No, it was great. And I'm glad we got more to do. So one of the things that we obviously started talking about is, what does the future of it look? And we started this already. And, one of our clients had made this comment, and because in some of the markets we do 3 different cultural segments between Black, Hispanic, LGBTQ, was at some point, you're going to be tracing down the same customer. So there's this intersectionality between 2 people who represent 2 subcultures, and not necessarily from a country of origin, but literally 2 major subcultures. So we started to look at, well, if we did an influence in Miami, maybe he's LGBTQ and Latino. We did another influencer, maybe they're Afro-Latino or Black and Latino. So, this is an important point of distinction, because look, you can't always just chase down each of the 3 groups individually with financially. Sometimes you have to find the intersection. But again, at some point you're talking to both of them. So speak to us about some of the things you guys are seeing emerge in the influencer realm in terms of this sort of intersectionality and how it's starting to play out and become a bit more sort of mainstream.
Yeah, I think that, perfect example in Miami, we're doing Rodner, who's great in terms of the creative that he was able to produce for us was amazing. But that's one where you can you're targeting a Venezuelan, so you're targeting a new group that's in the Miami area. He's, LGBTQ. He's a celebrity in his own in Miami in terms of, he's done a lot of TV appearances. He does a lot of shows and things like that. And he just has great energy. So he knows how to connect with the audience well. And then we're also looking at the Afro-Latina in Dallas. We found, a Dominican girl that's a model, and she was able to come to one of our Uncorked events, and she did a really great job with us in terms of really embracing the brand and with the photo shoot that she did. And then we also, I mentioned earlier, we did another partnership with De Chapelle, where she did some great stuff for us. Francisca De Chapelle, she did some great stuff for us in Miami as well, targeting that Dominican Afro-Latina community. So it's understanding that there's all these different subcultures, and you can get influencers that kind of talk to all these subcultures. And then that's a great thing about, influencer marketing.
Right. No, it's great. I mean, it was great for us to move, some of the stuff, some of the influencers beyond what we did in terms of activation around a vehicle, and then have them then come to an event. So the way we started to look at it was like, what are all the things and extensions related to Lexus in the market that we can put them in front of and attach them? So, I mean, it was amazing. And some of the influencers, they were tied to media properties. I can't ever pronounce his name, the chef Yesus. How do you pronounce it? Yeah. So he was tied to Univision, correct?
He was he just won. He was doing on the Mira Quien Baila show. So we're excited. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the thing was great. It was like everybody wasn't just, a social influencer. I mean, some of these people represented major media companies. So they were in itself had their own brand, but they were tied to even some of the other partners we work with. And I think that's the other thing that people have to sometimes discount and take to note, that some of these people are tied to major properties. One, they're easily PRable, but two, they have a vested interest in obviously in the brand, because some of the companies they work for we're clients of theirs as well. So it was great. I think the other thing we got into was, really this discussion around, look, it's great to find influence to the max brand, but it's the followers that matter, because one influencer represents one head count. And for automotive, it represents one car sale, if there is one. So we started to look at, how do we get to the following, and how do we get into kind of the retargeting conversation? And I think, our partner at Water Social, and we made the introduction of their capability, can pull the audience file of any influencer almost as a data file. And a lot of the things that we're going to start to look at is, well, how do we retarget them? Not only through social, but basically through the open web, back through the Adsmovil's console. So we could retarget the following through your CTV offering or through your digital audio offering. So I think one of the things that just in a quick soundbite is, kind of talking through how we can enlist an influencer, then start to double down on the following, and then retarget them through the same digital channels that we're already activating with you guys.
Right. So that's one of the great things in terms of, working as a partnership with Adsmovil is, once we have we have that influencer marketing, we can continue to follow those their followers to what are they consuming? Are they on CTV? Are they consuming any specific type of audio? What websites are they going to, or mobile websites? What apps are they engaging with? So it's again about how you said, not only engaging with them once on that Instagram or Facebook feed, but continuing to follow them and continuing to get that message out to that specific users. So that's one of the things that we can help in terms of, broadening the marketing approach to any advertiser.
Right. Well, great stuff. Well, listen, it's been a pleasure. Enjoy the conversation, the banter going back and forth.
It's always great.
We'll continue to keep our sort of back channels open as we look at how this is going to evolve for us to support, in particular, the Lexus brand. So obviously, we want to thank everybody who tuned in.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And then at this point, we'll probably open up to Q&A. So we'll have Stuart coming back on, and then I think Andrew will rejoin us as well.
Yep.
And here we are. Well, great conversation, Albert and Zulema. Really interesting stuff. And I'm sure, and as I could see from all the questions coming in from the audience, just lots of questions on this area overall. So we are going to move into audience Q&A. So I just want to pause here. Let's let everyone catch their breath for a second. If you do have a question for our speakers, I just want to invite you, use the question tool that you should see there under It should be right under the video window. And just submit your questions. We're going to get to as many as we can over the next 10 minutes or so. If we don't have time to get to your question, I will make sure that they get forwarded over to our sponsor. So there's the opportunity for someone to possibly respond to you offline. I also just want to provide a couple of quick reminders because we always do get these questions. Number one, there was a lot of information on that slide deck. So if you would like a PDF of today's slides, they are available. If you go into the event resources area, you should see that tab right by the question tool that you see there on the left side of your screen. Also, today's webinar has been recorded and will be available on demand. We're going to send you a link to that on-demand version about 3:30, 4 o'clock today. So if you have any colleagues who you think would be interested in this topic, and I can't imagine that you have colleagues who wouldn't be interested in this topic, just simply feel free to share that link with them directly, or better yet, have them register. We'll send them that link as soon as it is available. All right, let's move into some of these questions. So let me just grab these. And look, I'm just going to sort of start with sort of a classic one, which is, Zulema, we've talked a lot about, obviously, the full range of Latino subcultures. Mm-hmm. And we could keep going on, and we could, especially as we sort of go through all that. But for many people, it's an issue of prioritization. So can you talk a little bit about, as people start to think this through, who may be taking more of sort of a monolithic approach to multiculturalism, how they can start to really sort of prioritize some of this? I would gather they have their research, they have plenty of research time ahead of them, but let's hear from you. What would you recommend?
So absolutely. I think one of the things that you can look at is, what markets are you looking? Are you going to do a national approach, or are you going to maybe do a specific market approach? So if you're going to look at a market like New York, understand the diversity of that market, right? And all the different makeup of all the Hispanic groups there. So maybe that's where you can maybe get a Caribbean-based or South American-based influencer or that type of marketing. And if you're looking at California or Texas, there's more of a huge Mexican population base there. But also don't forget that in LA, there's a big Salvadorian community as well. So I think it's really understanding, your approach as a marketer. Are you going to do something on the local level, or are you going to do something on a national level? And how do you kind of do a blanketed message where you can speak and resonate to that culture in an authentic way?
Okay. Albert and Andrew, anything to add on that?
No, I think it's a good point. It's like, it's also to note the scale, right, between the different subcultures that we talked about earlier, but to really look at the budget and maybe do test markets in the beginning and then scale from there. That's kind of a good way to do it as well. We've had a lot of brands that did that with us and have kind of followed the road to more of a regional approach and growing from that point on. So yeah, just that.
Yeah, from our perspective, was very much getting into sales data in terms of, and that gets you to market prioritization. And then I think, look, you have to spend some time understanding who's driving that in the market, because there are always assumptions, but you could find that it's an emerging segment that is a part of the growth versus who is foundationally kind of keeping you in business. And that's a bit of distinction. But again, it does require some sort of local market workup to really understand that. And look, I mean, I think we've done it through a series of partners to get what I'd call market level intel. And some of it is, beyond looking at census data and migration, it even looks at, media companies in terms of how the content's being consumed. Do you have an audience of this subculture in that region, just even from a program standpoint, and then starting to understand to what degree there's representation. So is there enough of a footprint to sort of follow, in particular if you're going to turn around and activate media? So again, some of it is getting a little creative and crafty because it's not, there's sort of black and white. And then, even speaking to people at ethnographic level, just to understand what is the sentiment and some of the behaviors at the market level to really help back into prioritization.
Yeah, and what KPI, where your KPIs are and where along the funnel you want to hit, right? I mean, it's from top to bottom, middle. I mean, it all counts, right, at the end of the day.
Got it. Albert, let me toss this one as you were talking about media and media buying, and a question came in, and I'm sure as we look at the Latino marketplace, this comes up pretty frequently, which is what language are people consuming media in? In particular, I think this person in this question is asking about second generation. Are they consuming English or Spanish? And should you be looking for in language as you go through that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we have by and large focused on what I would call a more fluent, by definition, U.S. Hispanic, who by nature is bilingual and sometimes maybe English first in terms of being spoken to. And you have to look at the distinction between the spoken language and written language. I mean, so from when we're looking at what shows up essentially in print, it is always in language. A lot of our advertising is always in language, to be around in language content. Otherwise, there's some blending and overlap of what I call general market advertising. And part of it is just the separation of the two budgets to not be in the same swim lane. So your targeting tends to be pretty much 100% essentially in language. When you think about platform and how agnostic it's going to be, social media gives you a little bit more latitude because you're using sometimes euphemism, slang terminology. You got to use things that represent the culture. So it's more or less how do you align and identify. When you look at, TV advertising, tends to make you sort of pick to be in language, to stay away from terminology that doesn't universally translate. So you have to take a brand safe approach. I think radio, again, that's the difference between, are you doing radio spots or are you aligning around podcasting? Where podcasting and the notion of the creator may blend a little bit more, but radio, terrestrial radio, traditional radio, you have to, again, pick a universal lane around word choices that everyone understands so you don't lose the receptivity of the consumer. So you do have to be a bit intentional. I think the other thing is casting, because look, as you see by the influencers that they showed, there are so many ranges of color, complexions, and tones. And so you can identify a Latino when they walk into the room just as easily as people think. So there's no stereotypical representation. There's even things trending on social media about, being Latino and looking white. But that's a real dynamic. That's a real thing. And again, part of it is doing the research and being conscious of what to do. But I think if you had to pick a starting point, authenticity is going to be in their spoken language, in language, without a doubt. If you're doing, English, you start to look at a lot of advertising now has a range of diversity in it, period, in its general market. But that is brands fixing the optics of not having a Caucasian dominant advertising approach. So you're starting to see Asian, Indian, Middle Eastern, Black, Latino. I mean, everything is in there. So to be more decisive from that, you need to be very intentional with all the elements that appear in screen, in audio, and starting with an in-language conversation first, because consumers are trying to understand, how serious are you about this?
Got it. Zulema, I want to send this one to you. I saw this question just came in. And this is someone asking for resources to better understand the different subcultures. And their comment, right, they're from a very, very large healthcare brand, right? But their comment, which I think is interesting, which is when they go and they look at panel information and they're looking at things like IRI, or they're looking at places like Nielsen, what they're seeing breakdowns by Hispanic and acculturated Hispanic.
Yeah.
Those are not the subcultures and the segments I've met to meet someone who I go over and it's like, and tell me a little bit about your culture. It's, well, I'm acculturated Hispanic. Usually you're going to hear, right, something slightly different as you go on there. Where would people go to learn and start to understand this a little bit more to get past this?
Yes, I think one of the places you can go is, your partnerships that you have with your media vendors. Like, we ourselves are, people that we can provide any type of research that you may need. We can provide any type of education, whether it's translation or anything like that you may need if you're looking to target a specific group. So that's where it comes into play. It's really, talking to your media partners and saying, okay, I want to reach a bilingual Hispanic in the Northeast, or I want to target millennial moms. Like, how do I best do that? So this is where, as media partners, we come in and we can say, okay, well, here's our recommendations. This is where the concentration is. This is a better way in terms of approaching them based on language preference, based on contextual strategy, what they're more into. So this is where, as partners, we come in and we build that partnership together.
Andrew, I keep seeing you nodding on this one. I feel like you have something you wanted to add.
No, I think Zulema's doing it brilliantly. I mean, I think, look, we've evolved, like I said before, from a mobile ad network company to really touch on all these channels. But then most recently with our data product, like what we did 2 years ago, we just give us really a deep insight into what the customer is consuming on content, whether they're, back and forth with Spanish and English, and we're tracking that. And, the insights that we get are really eye-opening. In terms of what they're consuming and at what frequency, at what length. And so, those insights are there. It's just, we need to market ourselves better, maybe. I don't know. But I mean, I think that now that's why we're doing these webinars, is we want to get the word out. We want to help people. And but there are other companies besides ourselves that do this. But again, it's available. We do have it.
I think the thing to look at with the culturated versus non, it comes down to brand and product familiarity. It's one thing if you're a brand of culture like Puma or Nike, where it's like, okay, what's the big deal in this country with those two brands? And that's part of the culture. So those people, you'd have to wait to assimilate and get on and understand why. But for a lot of other consumer choices, it's familiarity because this didn't exist in home country, or why is this such a big deal? And then for them to learn. You almost can't chase down that consumer because they're so far outside the funnel, they're not even ready to approach it, let alone come down it. So the level of culturation, I think, for an advertiser, they need to stop looking at it as the U.S. population. To what degree they've assimilated. They need to look at their product and say, do they understand what we represent, what we stand for? Are we as easily consumable as something you find at Walmart at every drugstore? Or are we more of a specialty product where you'd have to really know and understand why this particular application or solution suits you as it does the other subcultures of the Latino community in the U.S.? And I think that's where people are getting moved to, quote unquote, the product level, the brand level, the portfolio level, and talk about, do they have familiarity with what you sell? Remember, and to a lot of the major media companies, all brands are looking for a buyer. Okay, so that's a different question than the acculturation around content consumption. And I think that's where people need to start to understand. Brands need to upshift and move into the driver's seat of, let's understand if they understand product and our product attributes and what that represents.
Right. There's a lot of blue chip brands out there that just do Spanish language only because they want to be on Spanish language properties because they think that's the only way they're reaching a Hispanic, but that's not the case. And they have to get away from that thinking. And, when you have the insights like this, and we're talking about this, we're hoping, brands see that and start shifting, and then use those resources to get into subculture, because they're going to need to do that moving forward. So,
yeah. Last question. I think we've got time if we answer this one quickly. And of course, I'm going to go into the question that is going to require an entire other webinar. But we had a few people asking, and that is how the heck do you identify and vet influencers? Right? If you're building an influencer-driven campaign in this situation, all right, and you saw all the lists, and I love LeJuan James. He wins for best name, and I will tell you, for someone with 2.2 million followers, I never I had not heard of him until we started going through this webinar. But all that said, look, someone with 2.2 million followers, you're going to obviously hear about, but you're talking again about specifically in micro and local. How do you go through, identify, and so. Albert, why don't we just start with you on sort of just a quick 1-minute response here?
Yeah, I mean, our clients, they want people who have passion for the brand. They don't just want an influencer. They want someone who's essentially passionate about it. So that's part of the lens. And we enlisted to Adsmovil, like, you need to find people who are Lexus aficionados and would drive the product regardless if they had an opportunity. I think the other thing you start to look at is, level of engagement. Because some people have high reach, low engagement, and vice versa. So that's part of the formula as well. When we start to look at who can move culture, who can move people, because everyone can't move people, following or not. But that has to be part of the conversation that is essentially represented. The other thing is, who is PRable versus not? Because sometimes clients will look at an influencer and say, okay, but I would never hire them as a brand ambassador. We tend to look at people who are brand ambassador worthy. That's a different lens than someone you just enlist to sort of pop some content. So we've always given our partners enough detail to understand, with a certain level of precision, who we are essentially looking at and err on the side of those who are most brand safe. And that doesn't matter if they're at a nano level or essentially at a mega level. And then perhaps, Zulema, you can talk to as a platform, how you have enlisted people worthy of being in your overall or larger database.
Yeah, absolutely. So as a platform, the first thing that we do is obviously we take, the KPIs that the client is telling us in terms of who they are looking to reach. And we have to make sure that there is, that brand safety, that affinity to the brand as well. Like, Albert said, we're not going to, recommend someone for Lexus that has like 20,000 posts of another brand, right? Another car brand. So we do our research, our due diligence to making sure that we're vetting all of our influencers to make sure that, they're the proper, voice for Lexus. And then also we make sure that, we want someone that's going to have that engagement, that's going to build in that engagement. And there's also going to be, fun and easy to work with as well, right? Because there's some that are kind of divas and are difficult to deal with. So we try to kind of take all those things into consideration. But the first thing is making sure that we're vetting our influencers to making sure they fit with whatever KPIs our clients are trying to establish.
Yep.
All right, listen, I want to thank the three of you here, Andrew Polsky and Zulema Baez from Adsmovil, and of course, Albert Thompson from Walton Isaacson. Great information, great conversation. Wish we could go on longer. Unfortunately, we don't have the time. Just to our audience, if we didn't get a chance to get to your question, I will make sure it gets forwarded over to our sponsor. So just know that you're not being ignored. We just unfortunately don't have enough time to take all of the questions that have come in today. Also, if you want, again, final reminders, you want the slides, just look in the event resources area, download those. We're going to send you a link to the on-demand version. Check your email, 3:30. And finally, adweek.com/webinars, our webinar calendar. See what we've got coming up, sign up for an upcoming webinar, or check out our archive of on-demand webinars. So again, thanks to our sponsor, Adsmovil, and to our speakers. I want to thank our audience for taking time out of your busy day, and we look forward to seeing everyone at an upcoming AdWeek webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Albert, Zulema.
Yeah, Albert, thanks.
Absolutely. Take care.